Hey folks, welcome back to My Kitten Reads. I'm Eleanor and this is my May reading wrap up. Sorry it's a bit delayed. It should have been last weekend, but I've spent most of the last week with back problems and headaches, so I didn't really feel up to it last week. But I'm feeling a bit better today, and so it's time to catch up on a little bit of booktubing. I read 8 things in May, so I'm still not doing hugely well, given that I'm supposed to average about 10 a month. I also have not started this month very well, but we'll get to that next month, and I have hopes. But yes, I read 8 things in May. Almost none of them met any of my actual goals. There was maybe one book that met one of my goals. So yeah, but I still did do some reading. Honestly, the reason I got as much read as I did was because in May we hit the graphic novel module of my university course, Literature and the Visual. So I read 3 graphic novels. So yay! But yes, that's what I started with in May. Yeah, I know I've been in lockdown, but I've been more watching television than actually reading, so that's a bit weird. But anyway, yes, graphic novels that I read. I started out the month with The Death Ray by Daniel Clowes. Not something I would have picked up on my own, not something I particularly enjoyed. It's supposed to be a kind of deconstruction and takedown of superhero comics, and really is about sort of how terrible people are. And so if you give them something, a superpower of some sort, they continue to act like terrible people and they're not to be trusted with the power. It's also interesting in the fact that there are 3 possible endings, so it's a bit like a choose your own ending kind of thing. But yeah, even the art style I didn't particularly like. It was a very vintage art style, not really my thing. So that was The Death Ray by Daniel Clowes. Then I read, and this took me a while, it took me a week once it finally arrived, I read Mouse by Spiegelman. So this is really, really, really good, but it's also really, really, really hard to read for a graphic novel because it is essentially biographical. It's basically Art Spiegelman's father telling Art his story about being in concentration camps as a Polish Jew in Poland in World War II. So Art Spiegelman's father actually survived Auschwitz, which is kind of horrifying because not many people survived Auschwitz. And what happened in these camps is really, really hard to read. Particularly in the political climate we're in right now, I must admit, a lot of it felt very familiar. Like the early part of the book where he's talking about growing up and meeting Art's mother and the jobs that he had, a lot of the treatment received by the Jews in Poland, not good, and all too familiar. A lot of the behaviour is all too familiar. Yeah, it was a hard read. It's a very good read. It uses as sort of a distancing tool in that all the characters are actually animals. So it's all in black and white, and all the characters are animals. So all the Polish Jewish characters are mice, all the Germans are cats, the non-Jewish Poles are pigs, and there are a few other different ones that pop up around the place as well. But yeah, it was very, very difficult to read. So very, very good. And if you are in the right headspace to want to read a graphic novel about the Holocaust, I recommend it, but make sure you're in the right headspace. Make sure you have the emotional fortitude to actually cope with it. And I wouldn't recommend reading it before bed. Really wouldn't. Do it in broad daylight. Yeah, so that's Mouse by Art Spiegelman. Then I read Bitch Planet Volume 1 Extraordinary Machine by Kelly Sue DeConnick and Valentine de Landro. So this was, again, really good. I've heard a lot about it. Essentially, Bitch Planet is set in a future where we're in space, but the patriarchy is a thing, It's a hugely patriarchal society, and women who don't conform are sent to a prison planet, essentially, that is colloquially known as Bitch Planet. And, you know, the first volume, at least, is very much about setting it up and setting up the society they live in, and also showing some of the ways that these women are starting to resist. In particular, there is an issue in the middle of this volume which gives the backstory to one of the characters, Penny Royale. It's really good. It's quite confronting. There's a lot of nudity. I'm not really counting it as queer. There is some queer content, but they're not really, at least in the first volume, they're not really the main characters that are in a sort of lesbian sexual relationship. They're a couple of side characters. So I'm not counting it as one of my queer protagonist books, but there is some queer content in Bitch Planet. So it was good. It was confronting. Be aware that the entire point of it is to try and make some political points, to be honest. Lots of characters of colour, which is really good. Lots of different body shapes and body types. All sorts of things. So, yeah, I would recommend Bitch Planet Volume 1 for any sort of feminist comic reader. So that was the thing. The next thing I finished in May was Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, which was a reread. Bit of comfort reading at the moment. I think everybody needs comfort reading. So this is, of course, a classic. And it is the story of the two sisters, one who is sensible and one who gets carried away by her sensibilities and their romantic endeavours. So that was that. I also finally managed to get around to finishing the Uncanny magazine's Disabled People Destroy Fantasy special issue. I had started this before the lockdown when I was still going to the gym, and then just hadn't picked up my Kindle, but I finally sat down and finished it. It's full of really great stories. I can't remember any off the top of my head, but there was some really, really interesting content in there that I really liked, with protagonists that have various disabilities, or not even necessarily disabilities, but just different states of being. And all fantasy stories, which these days I kind of tend towards fantasy rather than science fiction when what I like. So I would really recommend Uncanny Magazine's Disabled People Destroy Fantasy special issue, which was from last year. Then I managed to do some more audiobook reading, and I managed to finally finish In the Fifth at Malory Towers, which I had been reading previously when I was going on my Malory Towers binge. And I also listened to the audiobook for Last Term at Malory Towers, which is, I believe, the final one that was written by Enid Blyton. Growing up, I only knew that there were 6 books. So, but at some point, someone has actually written more books in this series, as well as more books in the St. Clair's series. I've never read any of those. I tend to stick to the original 6 by Enid Blyton. So that is 2 audiobooks that I finished, both Malory Towers ones. Really, really enjoyable, really, really lovely boarding school stories from the 1940s. And then the final thing I read was something that actually barely had a couple of days on my TBR, and that is Unreal Alchemy by Tansy Rayner Roberts. This is the first collection in the Belladonna University books. I adore this series. It's a series of like novelettes and novellas and short stories. I had the excellent experience of being asked to kind of beta read, not really beta read, but read the draft of the first story, Fake Geek Girl, before it was published, just from a fandom perspective to see if it made sense, all the references. So I'm very, very attached to this story. This series, you all know how much I love Tansy's work, and this is one of my favourite series of hers, and this is her self-published first volume of 4 of the stories in this universe, one of which I hadn't actually previously read. I probably had access to it as a Patreon supporter, but hadn't actually read it. So that was the final story, which is a prequel in this book, which is, what's it called? Can't remember what it's called. But yes, anyway, The Alchemy of Fine. So this has got like the first 3 stories plus The Alchemy of Fine, which is the prequel. And it follows the lives of a group of friends and their university rock band where they're going to a university of magic. So there's Hebe, who's identical twin sister. Holly is the local campus superstar, and Hebe keeps being mistaken from her, but Hebe is quite shy and retiring. You've got Holly, who of course is the lead singer of Fake Geek Girl, who keeps writing songs about her geeky sister and her sister's geeky friends. You have Sage, who used to date Hebe, then realised he was gay and is now the drummer in the band. You've got Juniper, who plays the cello and who just wants Holly to notice her. And then you've got, who else? So, Third, who used to be like this rich brat in the magic circles who had all this power, had an accident, now no longer has magic and isn't having to learn to cope with it, and likes Hebe. And you've got his 2 friends as well, Jules, who has this like shag relationship with Sage, and his other friend Viola, who just wants her friend back. And they have shenanigans based around this geeky rock band that they are all involved with, and their manic pixie dream house share house. I really recommend this series. You can tell I am babbling about it. So yeah, if you get a chance to read any of these, most of the stories are available on the Sheep Might Fly podcast if you want to listen to them. I'm not sure how much you can get access to the physical books, because I bought this as part of a reward for Tansy's latest Kickstarter, but you can definitely get this volume on ebook, I'm pretty sure. So I really recommend, if you love fantasy and university stories and just funny, bantery relationships and music and geek culture, definitely try the Belladonna University Stories. I really recommend them. So that was my May reading. So Unreal Alchemy is the one that I'm basically counting as one of my queer protagonist ones, because there are at least a couple of the main characters who are queer. Otherwise, didn't meet any of my goals for the month. This month, fingers crossed, I have had a slow start because I had my final essay due and then I was unwell, but I have finally gotten around to organising myself regarding my Hugo reading, which is due in a month. Voting is finishes middle of July. So I have started reading the short stories, and I'm going to try and work my way through at least the short stories, novelettes and novellas in the next month. So if I can do that, my reading should look a lot better next month. So fingers crossed. Let me know if you like any of the books that I've spoken about. I'm always happy to talk about them in the comments, and I will see you all again really soon. Bye!